Hi, this is Jaden who wants to be the best booktuber on YouTube. The book recommended for you in this video is The Origin of Wealth. The author, D Beinhocker, is the head of the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford University. Why is the book called The Origin of Wealth? Because this book gives a very unique explanation of how wealth is generated. We know that human wealth has exploded in the last 200 years. If we consider the 2.5 million years of human evolution as a whole, then these 200 years is the last millionth moment of this history. In other words, in a single moment of history, there was a sudden surge of the vast majority of existing wealth. What's more, the growth of wealth is not only in terms of quantity. In some primitive tribes in South America, the standard of living of people is stuck at the stage of human ancestors 15,000 years ago. The authors estimate that the average income level of New Yorkers in the United States is 400 times that of this tribe, a difference of 2 orders of magnitude, which is sort of what we would expect. What is surprising is the difference in the number of commodities in these two economies. There were only a few hundred commodities available for exchange in the original tribe, while New York City had tens of billions of different commodities, a difference of 8 orders of magnitude. So, why is there a Cambrian explosion of wealth in terms of quantity and variety? The so-called Cambrian explosion refers to the sudden emergence of a large number of species of life on Earth during the Cambrian period, more than 500 million years ago. This explosion of life is the result of the natural evolution of biological systems. So, is it possible that the explosion of wealth, similar to the explosion of life, is the result of a systematic evolution? This is the question that this book will answer. Of course, the author's ambition does not stop here. The author's ultimate goal is to tear down the century-old edifice of mainstream economic theory and create a new theoretical framework, which the author calls complex economics. It is no exaggeration to say that complex economics is a major paradigm shift in the discipline of economics, much like the impact of quantum mechanics on classical physics, which will fundamentally change the way we understand the economy. In the following, I will give you a detailed explanation of how the origins of wealth can be explained through the lens of complexity economics in 3 ways. First, the authors argue that mainstream economics went off the rails 100 years ago and took the wrong path. Why is this? Second, what new perspectives do complex economics offer us on the hard problems of economic cycles and stock market crashes? Third, why do we say that wealth is not created but evolved? The first point is why the authors believe that mainstream economics went off the rails 100 years ago and took the wrong path. As we know, during the period of Adam Smith's classical economics, economics was a philosophical idea, and Smith and other classical economists considered themselves philosophers, not economists, much less scientists. At that time, economics only used simple mathematics, and Adam Smith never mathematically argued how the market mechanism, the invisible hand, could achieve the optimal allocation of wealth. However, later economists were dissatisfied with this state of affairs and wanted to make economics more scientific, preferably with precise mathematical models to describe economic phenomena, just as physicists can use a mathematical formula to describe the trajectory of an object. The first to make such an attempt was the French economist Léon Walras. In 1872, Léon Walras published a magnum opus called The Essentials of Pure Economics, which marked an important turn in mainstream economics, the beginning of the marginal revolution. Léon Walras viewed an economy as a closed system in which a certain amount and type of wealth are randomly distributed to people with different preferences, who can trade to reach an economic equilibrium. The authors argue that this is where mainstream economics goes off the rails. Why? The problem lies in the concept of equilibrium. It is a concept that Léon Walras borrowed from the physics of his time. According to the Oxford Dictionary of Physics, equilibrium is the state of a system in which forces, influences, and reactions balance each other so that no net change occurs. For example, in a closed physical system, equilibrium is said to have been reached when the various energies no longer transform into each other. Leon Walras took this concept directly and argued that the economy is a closed system and that at some price point, supply is exactly equal to demand, at which point the market clears, the economy achieves equilibrium, and resources are optimally allocated. Later, mainstream economists introduced more and more mathematical tools into the equilibrium model along the lines of Leon Walras. The author argues that the greatest contribution of marginal theory to economics is the introduction of mathematics, which allows economists to express complex economic phenomena with elegant mathematical formulas, making economics look more scientific than other social disciplines. But note that the cost of doing so is also very high and may not be worth the effort. First, to be as precise as physics, economics means that individuals in an economy must behave in the same uniform and predictable way as objects in the physical world. So how do you take human behavior, which varies widely in the real world, and make it predictable? To solve this problem, Leon Walras gave the classic economic man hypothesis, assuming that everyone is selfish and rational. We all know that in reality, people are neither completely selfish nor completely rational. You may say that there is no absolute straight line in the real world, but we can abstract a straight line to approximate reality. Why can't economics abstract human behavior? But the fundamental problem here is not that human rationality is abstracted, but that it is misunderstood. There are two types of cognitive models, one is called inductive and the other is deductive. Humans are best at the first one, the inductive method. It is the induction of cognitive patterns from existing knowledge and then applying this pattern to the new knowledge. This is why humans like to listen to stories, because they contain a wealth of cognitive patterns. What computers are good at is the second kind, the deductive method. That is, given some preconditions, then through a series of logical deductions, to come to a new conclusion. In the real world, most of us make decisions inductively, while the economist assumes that people, like computers, make decisions deductively. Both types of decision-making are rational, but the results can be very different. This is why economic models are difficult to explain real economic phenomena. Moreover, the economic man assumes that everyone has the same absolute rationality, which means that it is impossible to progress through learning, which is absurd. Secondly, mainstream economics regards the economy as a closed system and only studies how the limited resources in it should be allocated, but not how the new wealth comes, treating this most important economic problem as an exogenous variable of the system. This is a major flaw. More importantly, can the economic system be seen as a closed equilibrium system? At the time of Leon Walras, the second law of thermodynamics had not yet been discovered in physics. According to this law, the entropy in a closed system increases, which means that the system becomes more and more chaotic and disorderly. When the value of chaos reaches its maximum, the system no longer produces any changes, which will reach equilibrium. If Leon Walras had known the second law of thermodynamics, he would never have seen the economic system as a closed equilibrium system. The economic system must be an open system, where energy and matter are constantly flowing in and out, thus creating new orders, structures, and patterns. In short, the author argues that the marginal revolution of more than 100 years ago took mainstream economics down the wrong path. The equilibrium model of mainstream economics is not at all how the economy works, and the assumptions of mainstream economics about the economic man misunderstand the way human beings make decisions. These major flaws make mainstream economics neither good at explaining major economic phenomena, such as the origin of wealth and economic cycles, nor effective at predicting the economy. To explain the huge differences between economic models and the real world, later economists had to tinker with marginal theory, such as proposing innovation theory, information asymmetry, finite rationality, etc., but could not save the fundamental flaws of this theoretical framework. The theoretical framework of mainstream economics has not changed much since Leon Walras launched the marginal revolution. On the other hand, the theoretical framework of physics is constantly iterating, shifting from Newtonian classical mechanics to relativity, quantum mechanics, chaos theory, complexity theory, and so on. If you look at economists from the perspective of contemporary physicists, you will feel that they are people who have traveled from 100 years ago and are still clinging to the 100-year-old physics model. It is time to build a new theoretical building for economics, which is complexity economics. Unlike mainstream economics, complexity economics views the economy as a complex adaptive system. What does complex adaptive system mean? Complex means that there are many actors in the system. Adaptive means that these actors are adaptive, that is, they can interact with each other, learn, and adjust their behavior. The whole system evolves continuously. For example, an ant colony is a complex adaptive system. Individual ants have low IQs and are certainly not highly rational individuals as assumed by economic man. However, this does not prevent them from interacting through simple signals and then accomplishing very complex tasks, such as building anthills, conducting organized attacks and defenses, and so on. In addition, systems like our body's immune system, the brain's nervous system, biological ecosystems, internet systems, etc., are all complex adaptive systems. Look at the economy as a complex adaptive system. You will find that many economic phenomena that could not be explained by mainstream economics before become explainable all of a sudden. For example, the economic cycle. According to the equilibrium theory of mainstream economics, when the economy is booming, prices rise, people will naturally consume less, and the economy will not overheat. And when the economy is in recession, prices fall, people will naturally consume more, and the economy will not collapse. Through the price mechanism, the invisible hand of the market is like a thermostat. The economy can be controlled in the appropriate range. It is simply impossible to occur in large economic fluctuations. This, of course, is not consistent with the facts. One of the characteristics of a complex adaptive system is that it is a dynamic system which can form positive feedback. We all have the experience that a microphone that is too close to the speaker will make a harsh noise. This is because the sound is cycled and amplified between the microphone and the speaker, creating positive feedback. Positive feedback is a cycle of acceleration, amplification, and self-reinforcement that causes the system to show exponential growth or exponential collapse. Economic cycles are formed by positive feedback in an economy. For example, if people are pessimistic about the future, they will reduce consumption, and a reduction in consumption will lead to a corresponding reduction in production, which in turn will lead to a reduction in employment, so people will be even more pessimistic about the future and will further reduce consumption, which will eventually lead to severe depression. In this process, the market mechanism is dysfunctional, and it is impossible to pull the economy back to equilibrium by the power of the market itself. You may say, whether it is a depression or a bubble, it cannot last indefinitely, and eventually, the economy will return to equilibrium. But as Keynes said, in the long run, we are all dead. If it coincides with a stormy season, economists can only tell us that the sea will return to calm after the storm, so that the task they set themselves seems too easy, too useless. The role of government intervention is to stem the vicious cycle of economic decline by restoring confidence in the market. It's important to note that positive feedback is not just a negative effect. In fact, positive feedback has a huge benefit in that it can break through the growth frontier. We all know that mainstream economics has a famous law of diminishing. Producers will appear to have diminishing marginal returns on inputs, and consumers will appear to have the diminishing marginal utility of consumption. It is this law of diminishing returns that makes it impossible for producers to unrestrainedly input and consumers to unrestrainedly consume, so that supply and demand can be maintained in equilibrium. However, in some cases, positive feedback mechanisms can break the curse of diminishing returns. For example, technological progress. The more technology is invented, the greater the stock of human knowledge, and the greater the gains from each new invention. Investment in technology is a classic case of increasing marginal returns. Increasing marginal returns can break the so-called equilibrium state of mainstream economics and achieve explosive growth. Well, as we said earlier, mainstream economics does not explain economic cycles. Likewise, mainstream economics does not explain the stock market crash. According to equilibrium theory, the stock market will remain in a clearing state until new news comes in to break the equilibrium. In other words, if there is a stock market crash one day, the cause must be outside the stock market, such as the impact of major news. There are times when this argument holds, such as when 9/11 did trigger a shock in the US stock market. But there are times when this argument is not valid, such as the famous 1987 stock market crash when there was no major news event at all and the New York Times headline that day was fears of dollar devaluation and trade deficit, a headline that could have been made on any day. So how do you explain the 1987 crash? The stock market itself is subject to volatility, even in the absence of external news, as long as it is viewed as a complex adaptive system. There are a variety of traders in the stock market who are not completely rational economic people, but have different mental models and investment strategies. These people are constantly influencing each other in the market, learning from each other, and constantly adjusting their strategies. Which strategy will be profitable in a given period has little to do with the value of the stock itself, but depends mainly on what strategies are used by other actors in the market. In this highly interactive process, the stock market can appear sometimes calm and sometimes violent, and bubbles and crashes can appear from time to time. Computer technology is now able to simulate this process perfectly, thus proving that the operation of the stock market itself is sufficient to cause a stock market crash. Looking further, if the stock market is a complex adaptive system, then one of the most important assumptions in financial markets, the theory of random walk, is wrong. Mainstream economics assumes that the price of stocks wanders randomly. According to the laws of mathematics, stochastic data should have a bell-shaped distribution, that is a curve with a high center and low sides. Mainstream financial theory and risk assessment models are based on bell-shaped curves. According to these models, something like the 1987 US stock market crash would take billions of times the life of the universe to happen once. And what about the fact that a crash of equal destructive power happens once every few decades? Well, if the economy is viewed as a complex adaptive system, then many phenomena that previously could not be explained by mainstream economics, such as economic cycles and stock market crashes, make sense all of a sudden. However, there is still a problem that has not been solved, which is the origin of wealth problem that we raised at the beginning. If we look at it from the perspective of complex economics, how exactly is wealth created? Since Adam Smith, economics has had two most important topics: how wealth is created and how it is distributed. Adam Smith was very concerned with how wealth is created from nothing. We are familiar with Adam Smith's answer, which is to increase social wealth by increasing the efficiency of production through the division of labor. But it is clear that the division of labor alone is not enough to explain the explosive growth of human wealth in the last 200 years, and there must be other sources of wealth creation. But then, starting with the marginal revolution, mainstream economics studied the only distribution and not the creation of wealth. Mainstream economists attribute the explosion of wealth to factors outside the economic system, such as technological progress, which are outside the scope of economics. This leaves the origin of wealth as an unresolved mystery. The authors argue that if economics does not explain the origin of wealth, it is like physics without the Big Bang theory and biology without the theory of evolution, which is something unimaginable. Well, today, complexity economics provides us with a new explanation of the origin of wealth. Let me conclude by saying that from the perspective of complexity economics, wealth is not created but evolved. Complex economics suggests that economic systems belong to a smaller subset of complex adaptive systems, which are evolutionary. It is important to note that the economy is an evolutionary system like biological systems that share a set of evolutionary algorithms. Suppose you now have a box of Lego sets containing 500 blocks of different shapes and colors. How many different designs can be assembled with this set of blocks? About 120 to the power of 10. If you arrange each design in turn, the whole universe would not fit. If you browse through each design in turn in this showroom, which is larger than the universe, you will find that 99.99% of them are very boring and unstructured, with only the occasional magnificent castle or a beautiful spaceship. However, you may have to spend millions of years to come across a slightly more interesting design. Such a search method is too inefficient. The evolutionary algorithm is to help you from this huge showroom, reliable and fast to find those good designs. Or as the philosopher Daniel Dennett put it, evolution is an algorithm that searches for the thin needle in the haystack. How does it work? First, an evolutionary algorithm encodes each different design. In a biological system, this code is the DNA. In an economic system, this code is the different business plans. Then, a reader is needed to read the code. In a biological system, the interpreter is the organism. In an economic system, the interpreter is the business. Finally, an arbiter is needed, which is the external choice environment faced by the organism and the business. With these preparations in place, you are ready to press the search button of the evolutionary algorithm. Now imagine that you have suddenly arrived in an unknown area. Where the terrain is low and dangerous, you must try to move up and stay as high as possible. But it's dark all around, you can't see anything, you can only feel the change in terrain height. What are you supposed to do? You can only take a random step in all directions, and if you feel that the terrain has become higher, you continue to step in that direction. If you do not feel the change or the terrain has become lower, then you go back and try a new direction. In this way, eventually, you can come to a localized highest place. But please note that it is only localized. There are likely to be many peaks of varying heights spread throughout this area, and you may well have just come to the top of a small hill. At the top of this local area, you are going downhill in any direction, so there is no way you can find a higher peak by going through the original way again. At this point, you must abandon your original strategy and make a daring random jump to see if you can just happen to jump to a neighboring hill to explore. Only, such a jump is very risky and likely to fail. However, as long as there are enough explorers like you, you are sure to find the peak. This is the algorithm of evolution. Evolution searches for peaks in the whole area quickly by step-by-step gradual changes and random jumping mutations. The author of this book says that evolution is like a gambler and a gambler with high odds of winning. Both economic and biological systems share such an evolutionary algorithm, so they are both evolutionary systems. You may wonder, the evolution of biological systems is a blind, random process, while in economic systems, both business models and technological advances come from purposeful human design. Are they the same? It does not matter whether the design is purposeful or not. What matters is that the system can emerge with enough variation and be able to select and amplify the variation to create new things, new knowledge, and new growth that is more adaptive, which is the essence of evolution. Evolutionary algorithms contributed to the Cambrian explosion of species and, as we mentioned at the beginning, to the explosion in the variety and quantity of goods in modern society. Therefore, the author says that wealth is not created but evolved. Further, there is more than one evolutionary process in the economic system, but the result of the interaction of three evolutionary processes. The first is the evolution of physical technology, such as the invention of steam engines and computers. The second is the evolution of social technology, such as the invention of money, joint stock companies, and bankruptcy. The third is the evolution of business design, such as business strategy and management methods. The author argues that it is the coevolution of these three evolutionary processes that have led to today's great explosion of wealth. The author argues that the marginal revolution of the late 19th century set mainstream economics on a wrong path of development, leading to a serious disconnect between economic models and economic reality. We need to introduce a new framework for economic analysis, namely complex economics. Mainstream economics sees the economy as a closed, static linear system, while complexity economics sees the economy as an open, dynamic nonlinear system. Mainstream economics is based on the equilibrium perspective of early physics, while complexity economics is based on the evolutionary perspective of biology. Complex economics can explain many phenomena that mainstream economics cannot explain, such as economic cycles, stock market crashes, and wealth growth. From the perspective of complexity economics, wealth is not created but evolved. It is the evolutionary algorithm that has led to the explosion of wealth in modern society. Congratulations, you've grown up again. Subscribe for more book reviews and recommendations like this, turn on the notification, and leave a like to help the channel out. You can also click the share button to share this video with your friends. Thanks for your watching.